this is the panel discussion session, so that means like all of the attendees are able to interact with us during the Q&A session. So do raise your hand when you do so. We do have our broadcast manager who's manually allowing every attendee to be able to talk to us and turn on their audio and their cameras. So let's see the attendees. Okay, no, okay, all good, panelists. Alrighty. So once again, thank you to all the speakers for the second theme and talking about your expertise and also the narrative that you are doing within your field. I found it very interesting to hear Michelle about community narrative and Eliot when it comes to narrative in the public spaces. And I think it's also important to also stress that me as a journalist, and I think many other journalists will also counter or encounter such things where we want to talk about the narrative and also how is that affecting the minorities, particularly in the media or public discourse. And I draw a lot of inspiration from these academics and how their deeper understanding to have my work in an informed state. So I guess that goes into the question to all of the panelists. How do you think journalists should report on immigration, on minorities, on racism issue that really impact us? So any one of you can jump in.
I'll start. I have to say that recently, when I've been in contact with the media and they ask for information, I have been very shocked by the level of their initial basic level of the problem or the issue that they're going to write about. So I usually spend 30 or 40 minutes on the telephone with someone, basically reframing their story. So I guess my message is that, to me, clearly they need to kartlegge, what's that word? They need to figure out, map what kind of competence they lack and do something about expanding the competence base amongst their journalists so that the journalists are competent enough to engage with interview objects that they take contact with. And whether it's sometimes it's the producer, sometimes it's the actual program leader, sometimes it's a journalist, depends on whether it's newspaper or print media or the television. So I think my suggestion is they have to be a bit more critical about what they lack and what they need. And if they do that, then that has the potential to make some improvements or to create some positive change.
Does anyone else want to shoot in? Eliot?
Yeah, one of the things that became evident during the debate at Keynote about structural racism, having been some of the being part of the student bodies that were writing letters or had written some of the letters, it was very interesting for me whenever we had the media cover the incident and wanting to talk to us, that they came with preconceived ideas of, what the angle is, what one needs to say to fit into their already established positions, which is very strange to see a journalist covering a story already with a determined idea of what the piece should be. And so when what we've said didn't fit that, you could see how it was so well massaged. I mean, one of my colleagues, she had to complain 4 times to ask the media to quote her as she said. Like, you know, imagine fighting with a journalist to get them to quote you on what you said. And I was like, I couldn't understand, like, how is it that the state of journalism and reporting is at this stage? And I don't know what that to people like John Martin means in terms of, you know, how people are being trained and educated. But there certainly seems that a lot of people are not aware of the biases that they carry and bring into the stories they report. And so, you know, they often tend to see that more as this objective filter.
Would you say then that journalists here needs to have a little bit more training into this, to understanding their own you know, biases that they have in reporting? Now, what I find very interesting is that a lot of, we did have interns in the Oslo desk, and also these very early journalists, is that these quoting, you know, and sometimes they like to paraphrase the quotes. And there has been a lot of discussion in terms of, should we, if we're going to quote the source, whether we should give the source the quotes that we're going to use in the article to fact check. Now, I do that, you know, and in some cases I don't, but I think now more the quote is accurate as it should be. But sometimes I think, especially when I work with academics, is that they often have very long answers, and often I have to, unfortunately, I have to shorten it, and it's just the way it can be. And I don't know whether that sometimes gets misinterpreted bias as journalists, you know, or whether we've done academics justice in trying to understand what they saying in some ways. But I guess it's you know, this opens up to all panelists, you know, what other challenges were you facing when whether you're talking to a reporter or whether you're a reporter yourself, understanding, what the meaning is to the story and the impact of it. Perhaps, Michelle, I was thinking about Rahwa, you perhaps have been in contact with the press a lot, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement as one of the organizers. What kind of struggles have you experienced in trying to talk to journalists about the situation?
Well, like you, I think it was Eliot that said, they already have preconceived notions of what the story is supposed to be. So when they ask you questions, they're not really asking to get an answer from your side. It's more to lead you in a certain direction, which is very problematic. So I think it's very important that somehow the integrity of journalism should be restored. Because I feel like most of the times I don't even respect journalism anymore. I think maybe anti-bias courses in the curriculum would do some good. But also it's very important to have representation in not just the editorial, but in the boardrooms as well. Not that we have a lot of representation in the editorial, but it's also very important to have the boardrooms because that's where the important decisions are made.
You had something to say, Michelle?
I was going to say that to your point, I have to admit that most so-called academics we don't have very good media training, and we don't know how to answer questions directly, and we don't know how to create effective sound bites. So that's something that I've really been thinking about. How do you communicate with a broader public and not just talk like you're communicating to other anthropologists all the time? You know, even in your family, you know, you have to speak like a sapien and not like an anthropologist sometime if you want to be understood. And that is our biggest challenge in the discipline, I think, is learning how to engage the public and to be useful and to be understood. Yeah. So I understand that the quotes are too long.
I know Anthony wants to jump in. I was going to leave it to Q&A, but since you're an academic as well, I would love to hear a little bit of what you had to say on this as well.
Just short here, because there's also a fear amongst a lot of academics that what we say may be misinterpreted or lose some of the nuance. And, you know, scientific evidence can be very dangerous if you frame it in a wrong way. I mean, we have so many historical examples of science being used to abuse and oppress people. And so a lot of academics are sensitive to that. So there's a hesitancy to even engage with scientific communication because of that fear.
Thank you, Anthony. I think that, you know, one of the things I realized through my work as a journalist as well is that when I'm trying to find researchers on specific topics, it's like, you know, when I first did my investigation on bank access, you know, I had to turn to a think tank in the UK and look at their statistics and look at, you know, how they are reporting it and what they have discovered. But nothing has ever been done here in Norway. And I found that I had to go through a lot of university and asking, hey, do you have a researcher in the university, in this department, who can tell me a little bit about the barriers that an immigrant faces, especially when it comes to access to financial services? And this was quite frequent. It was not just at, you know, DC University on this particular topic, but it's on other topics that really impact minorities on a constant basis. And every single time I do talk to academics, you know, and, you know, there was a recent investigation that I did was looking into, you know, domestic violence and foreign mothers and, you know, foreigners in general, minorities of women. And I was reaching out to a specific department regarding their research. And I kind of felt like I was dismissed, kind of faffed off, you know, because of the name. And what I'm seeing is a constant, there's not much representation in academia. There's not much representation in journalism in general, in a lot of industries. And I think that is systemic, that can be an issue when it comes to storytelling. But in the work of Michelle and Eliot, you are collecting a lot of stories together in order to get a better understanding. And that can take, you know, quite a long time in order to collect that. You know, how do you go about it? And also, I guess as a journalist as well, for me, like collecting stories can also take time and to analyze as well. And it would, you know, come a little bit afterwards, especially investigations takes, you know, 6 months or even longer in some cases. So I'm trying to draw a sense of your work on, you know, how was the process, how was the funding process, what were the challenges, and even for us in the journalism world, when we try to get funding for investigation, it has also been difficult. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience, Michelle.
Too important to point out the few efforts that exist that have contributed to making a positive change. And I didn't get a chance to touch on that I ran out of time. I didn't plan well enough, but I definitely want to mention that when it comes to museums, archives, and library in the heritage sector, there are institutions who have been working tirelessly to improve issues of representation and the collecting and safeguarding of minority and international and other stories. I could mention the Cultural History, the Ethnographic Museum. Yes, they have a very, what should I say, spotty history when it comes to how they've mixed into colonialism and to representing non-European publics, etc. However, the Cultural History Museum in Oslo, connected to the University of Oslo, has worked for a very long time directly with communities, giving access and also building relations. I know that for a fact because I worked at the Cultural History Museum, and I have a relation, have had a long relationship with the staff there. Also, Oslo Byarkiv is my kind of hero institution when it comes to this kind of work. They had a project in the early 2000s where they collected several mini private archives related to minority organizations in Oslo. And they have built up a whole section of minority related private archives. For example, like early migrant communities to Norway, there were lots of associations like the Gambian Association. There's a Pakistani organization. There was a Fremmedarbeiderforening, so an organization with foreign workers. They have a robust and a very valuable set of private archives about early anti-racism, early organizations and individuals who did this very important work in previous decades, but most of us don't know about that because archives don't regularly promote their information. So, but that exists. And there are some other archives and museums in the country who have also emulated similar projects. And I write about that in one of those chapters that I posted, those examples. And then the second and short point is that, yes, it's very labor intensive work to go through a digital archive or through the digital library of the National Library and search keyword by keyword, looking for the appearance of certain terms, since the 1950s through 2020. But that's part of what my days are like. I just get hooked on an idea or something I want to know. What happened in 1960? How did this issue look in 1960? And it's just labor intensive, but it's very rewarding. And I feel like I've learned so much. And that's what made me understand that there needed to be a focus on telling the history of anti-racism and civil rights in Norway, because it has a long history in Norway. It's just that we don't know about it because the institutions, I should say the archival institutions don't promote it, even though some of the anti-racism organizations were involved in it and they were born out of those efforts. The public institutions are not promoting that as Norwegian history, and it should be promoted as general Norwegian history. So thanks for your patience.
Eliot, you said you had something to say. What was?
Yeah, touching on what Michelle said, it is quite labor intensive. I mean, just for my research, I've now done over 50 interviews and gathered probably somewhere in the region of 160 to 170 hours that I've had to transcribe and then write that data into a book collection. So this is, a process that's going to take a long time. And I guess in most cases, and sometimes maybe this is where the disjuncture or the point of departure is between kind of a researcher and a journalist, is journalists don't often have this kind of time to pour so many resources into a singular project. At least not I don't think that's common that you have such long sustained projects. You do tend to find them more in investigative journalism, as those projects often naturally require that process. And it's I don't know how in the journalism world you're working to kind of find the balance between substance and in-depth reporting. That very often, and this is kind of going back to much of what Rahwa was talking about in her presentation. and much of the way that she's approached by journalists, that you rarely have people who are jumping often into a topic that they didn't really know much about until the news clip um, was announced, and the breaking news were announced, and then everybody's sort of scrambling to report on the issue. But really, when you look at where they are in terms of understanding the context and the issue, and possibly give it a more in-depth perspective, that's often quite lacking. And maybe this is also related to the fact that, as Michelle points out, these archives are buried, often quite deep for people to find. I know that I'm one person who now has spent 2 years actively trying to find these archives, and they are just so difficult.
Yeah, that kind of leads me on to, because as you were talking, I was thinking a little bit about, when I started as a journalist, and also looking at how early journalists come out, I felt like we all have to kind of generalize in the sense that we have to cover a lot of ground, a lot of different topics. I don't know if this is something that you felt, Andy, or did you keep to one beat, or did you keep to several beats in order to, to cover as much ground, but also be able to take on as many assignments, especially as freelance journalist.
Thanks, Carmen. I think I can definitely relate to what you're saying there. And my experiences of a newsroom have been very much, let's get it first, let's get it out, which then goes back to what Rahwa was saying, to what Eliot is saying, how I've witnessed fellow journalists in the field, and perhaps myself, even as a junior journalist, you go into a situation with a preconceived notion of how you want the end result to be. And so what has helped me, though, is not to be one-dimensional in my beats, and to really do a deep dive and to do research, because that is fundamental to the kind of work that you do as a storyteller. It's one thing to chase leads and to make the front page, but it's another to really delve into the nuances that are so important. And these are things that I touched on or tried to touch on in my presentation as well, in that now, particularly with how media is going, where you have a cell phone and citizen journalism is rife, but every other person also has a right of say, what differentiates you as the practitioner, and it does go back to the fundamentals of creating a story, a report, whatever you want to call it, requires you to read and research and do all of these things. And sometimes time is not on your side, as Eliot said. You're not given 2 weeks to do a story, but it's not an excuse. And that's why our profession has become so tabloidy, and how, every other person is now a journalist. And it's the integrity factor that goes back to all of these fundamentals that really is being watered down, I believe. So I sit here turning the lens on myself, I'm sitting here learning and listening and really hearing what Michelle, Eliot, and Rahwa have been saying. And, what I spoke about with Western media on Africa, certainly what me as a journalist now, I can apply a lot of those things that I spoke about, and every other journalists in training, students need to hear that and be self-critical, and understand what our profession really is about. And now there's certain publications that we can name that really do that correctly, in my view. Anyway.
I think that leads me to two things as a journalist. One is about trust. How do you build trust with your community? How do you build trust with your sources? And I find that in a lot of these journalism training programs that I've been on, and also looking into certain degrees, both here in Norway and abroad, is that there's no discussion about how do you build that trust. you know, and also how do you make sure that, you know, when you're interviewing your source, and also, you know, when you're writing about your source, and I think Eliot was very said of something very nicely. You know, it's not just about the source, but you also want to participate, and also with the immigrant that you're talking to as well. And I think that is what I see journalism is going to be migrating to. That wall between the journalists and the public has to come down. We need to have them with us in creating stories together as co-creation, but also keeping with all the code of ethics and also the integrity of journalism, and making sure we're reporting accurately as much as possible, and so forth. So I think trust is very, very important, whether it's a trust to the source, a trust to our publication, and so forth. But the second thing that I run into problem, and I don't know if you have this as well, Andy, is that how do you report on them? The language that we use in reporting on certain people. Now, the word immigrant in Norway has always been a synonym to, you know, criminals, synonym to so many of these negative connotations. So I realized that when I'm in a lot of different forums, people do not want to be called immigrants. They rather be called an expat. They'd rather be called something else, which makes my job as a journalist harder. Because now I'm thinking, if I'm going to write a piece about a minority, how can I present that person? You know, and it's a constant dialogue, and also sometimes it requires some consistency as well in the language. So I kind of want to prick all of your brains really about, you know, how did you meet that? You know, obviously in academia you have a little bit longer time, but as journalists, you know, we're you know, hot on time, and we have to try and get things done. So Eliot, you had your hand up, so I guess you want to say something. So yeah.
Yeah, just a very small but useful and valuable advice that I also use. Just ask. How would you
That's what I
like
was
to
going to
be
say.
called? How would you like to be represented? You know, these are not so difficult, and I think that's the thing that we are missing is we don't think to ask, and maybe there's a way, or you know, to unpack why that is.
Good. Let me see. Now, this is something that came up in a discussion I had a little bit after the Black Lives Matter movement. And I guess this is going to be directed to Rahwa. So one of the interesting conversations was people were getting a bit fed up with a lot of these movements, especially the Black Lives Matter movement that's been going on. And I know it's been going on for decades. You know, once an event comes up with a murder case in the US, and it kind of springs up elsewhere. Now, one of the things that he commented on was the fact that he felt that these kind of protests and demonstration is, what it does is stop the healing. And what happens is that it continues, we're having more and more of these protests, and that's not going to come to an end, and there's no change that's going to come. So I want to have your thoughts on it, and whether is that the case, you know, because, you know, I'm starting to realize that I'm covering, and a lot of my colleagues are covering a lot of protests. Do you think these protests is creating change? And it is a part of healing as well, in the kind of trauma that as minorities we face on a day-to-day basis.
It stops the healing. I find that a very strange statement, because how do we heal before we acknowledge that we have a problem? I'm just confused about that. But as opposed to the protests and whether they're actually doing anything, well, the thing is, a lot of the people that come out protesting are, one, exercising their freedom of speech and their freedom of gathering, but also they are occupying space because that's the only way at that point. So no, I think protests have always been a very important part of pushing politics forward, pushing social discourse forward. It's very important because a lot of people are marginalized. Like I said, there are a lot of people that are in the margins. And how else are they going to be heard? So it's very important. It's also like, especially in Norway, in a country that we are like, you know, we talk about how we're a very democratic country and we support everybody's rights and blah, blah, blah. It is a part of the democratic process. I had one more thing to say. Yes, yes. It's also a freedom of speech until minorities do it. Everything. Sian are exercising their freedom of speech, and most of the times the attention goes to the violence and the aggression from the minorities or the Muslims or whatever you want to call them, or the left radicals. But when people come out protesting against, like, you know, police brutality in Norway or in the US or whatever, it's always these people are being sensitive, we're importing problems, XYZ. So no, I don't think they are, you know, causing some sort of halt to the healing process.
Great, thank you, Rahwa. So I would like to, let me see about the time. We do have some questions actually. But before we go on to the audience's questions, just like what I did with the other panel discussion, I would like to do a lightning round. Now, this lightning round is inspired by a CNN reporter, Richard Liu, where he basically says, you know, said something, and then you have to define it in one word. So, so I'm gonna just start. Journalism and media.
Crucial.
Marriage.
Restore.
Power.
Okay. Fake news.
Tabloid culture, double barrel word.
Only one word, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stop.
Ancient.
What did you say, Michelle? I did not hear you.
Ancient.
Mm.
It's not new.
Yeah. I'm really struggling, so I'm going to pass on this one.
Okay. Diverse narratives.
Yes.
More.
Essential.
Same.
Immigrant story.
More.
Sapiens.
Detrimental.
Needed.
Anna Solberg. I'm kind of putting you all on the table, aren't I?
I feel like I don't have right to reply because I'm still very new to this country. A politician, enough said.
Sapien.
Rahwa.
Hypocrite.
Eliot.
That's a good one. Yes. What she said.
Okay, keeping the spotlight on gender and racial representation in media.
Important.
Essential.
Encouraged.
Technology.
Scrutinize.
Double-edged sword.
Double-edged. Hey!
Compound words. No,
I know. Got you.
Same.